Okay. Hello, hello, hello. I'm going to give folks a second to come in and start asking questions. So, as soon as y'all get on, you are more than welcome to start dropping questions into the chat. And I'm more than happy to answer those as we move through tonight. As you come in, also feel free to introduce yourself and tell me where you are watching or listening from. And we'll get started in just a couple minutes. I'll start by introducing myself. I know that I was just on a stream with No CD a couple weeks ago. Some of y'all might also see me sometimes with the IOCDF. I'm a lead advocate with the IOCDF and do a lot of work with them around faith and mental health, but get to do a lot of work with No CD as well, particularly right now, trying to raise money for different individuals to receive treatment from No CD by racing 50 ultra marathons in 50 states for OCD. So just raced my first ultra marathon for No CD in, let's see, when was that? Around Halloween, and that was in North Carolina. I have another one that's coming up in April in South Carolina. So kind of clicking off one state at a time to race 50 ultras in 50 states for OCD treatment. And the reason that I do that is because, like many of y'all who are coming on here tonight, I have OCD. And I always like to be really clear and upfront about the fact that I'm actually clergy with OCD. I'm an ordained minister and I have OCD. So faith leaders, therapists, counselors, folks in leadership roles struggle with their mental health too. And that's really, really, really important to acknowledge. And for me, there was so much shame for such a long period of time. I had so much shame because of the intrusive thoughts that I was experiencing. I had so much shame because of the compulsions that I was doing. I was so fearful that people wouldn't respect me as a minister, that I wouldn't be able to make it through my ordination process, that people would think there was something wrong with me because of my OCD. And that's simply not the case. A few years ago, I went through a pretty intense OCD relapse, and for the first time started being public about my OCD so that I could help others, like folks listening here tonight, find treatment, receive exposure and response prevention. And particularly as a faith leader, it is so important for me to tell everyone that you are not alone, but also that some of the things that we sometimes hear in faith communities aren't always necessarily helpful for OCD. I have folks that come and talk to me all the time. I'm in the process of switching out of my interfaith chaplaincy role where I work at a school. We actually started back school today during COVID, so that's another interesting thing. So that's a different story. But I'm switching in 4 months out of that role to do faith and mental health work full time. I'm starting a faith and mental health integrative practice where I'm helping folks alongside their treatment, like the awesome treatment that folks are doing with No CD, really navigate some of the faith aspects that come up. Acknowledging that OCD is not a faith issue, but at the same time, sometimes OCD can latch onto those things that are really important to us, like our faith. And it's not about praying harder. It's not about resisting those thoughts or those urges. It's about sitting with that uncertainty. It's about going through the ERP. And for folks in faith communities, that can help them get back to a closer relationship with faith. For those of you who might be having obsessions around anything that's important to you, doing that treatment can help you get back to the significant things that you want to do that OCD is latched onto. I do see a question from Hannah. Is this actually live or is it a recorded video put live? So right now, Hannah, if you're listening, it is in fact live. If folks are watching at a later time, it might be recorded later on when you watch it, but right now it is 8:05 Eastern Standard Time on January 3rd. And I'm happy to say that I do a lot of OCD live streams, but this is my first live stream of the new year. So I'm really happy to be with y'all. So I'm going to go ahead and start tackling some questions in just a second, but wanted to give one other little note at the start of the new year before we really get in there. But feel free, just wanted to say, ask anything you want to ask. about OCD. I am not a clinician, but I am someone with OCD and someone who works a lot with folks with OCD, particularly around faith and OCD. So I'm happy to answer from a faith and mental health perspective. I'm also happy to answer from a lived experience as well as an advocacy perspective. So please feel free to ask anything, and I'll be super honest if I don't know the answer, because I might not, but I can do the best that I can, or at least point you in the direction of a place that you might be able to find that answer. Does anyone know what theme she has? Yeah, I can chat about that in just a second too. So feel free to ask questions about my story. But one of the things I wanted to note before we dive into questions is that I know the holidays have been particularly challenging for a lot of folks. I've been hearing from a lot of folks that the holidays have been challenging for a lot of reasons, where you feel like you have to be joyful or you feel like you have to feel a particular way. There might be things that are heightened where you remember times over the holidays that might have been tough. There might be things that are heightened with family. And especially going into the new year, I'm seeing posts over and over again of individuals really being told that they need to make this big New Year's resolution to change all of these aspects of themselves. And before getting into OCD questions tonight, I just wanted to note for everybody here that as someone with OCD, as someone who navigates a lot of the things that y'all are navigating, I'm not all that big on New Year's resolutions, because I think that sometimes we make a resolution and say something like, oh, I am never going to do compulsions ever again. And we might mess up. And then it feels like we're completely broken. It feels like we shouldn't even try anymore. I mean, sometimes New Year's resolutions sometimes don't give us room to make mistakes, and we're human and we do make mistakes. So I'm really big on making compassionate commitments, which means that you can strive to do something really meaningful for you, but give yourself compassion if maybe it doesn't go perfectly. So for me, one of my compassionate commitments this year is to be as present as possible and to find joy with my family, regardless of the things that OCD might tell me about myself, or regardless of if OCD says that it might be irresponsible. And yeah, I might not do it perfectly, but I think being able to strive for that and give myself compassion if I make mistakes in the process, at least for me, is a really helpful way to approach the new year. Okay, I see questions getting loaded up, so we're going to dive into OCD now that I've gotten on my little soapbox about New Year's resolutions. Let's see. I'm looking for some question marks here. Yeah, so I'm seeing some folks answer this question too. I've been suffering from OCD for 3 months now. I keep washing my hands after touching things that I feel are gross. I don't feel satisfied after washing hands once. I continuously get those urges. Yeah, so of course, to actually navigate if this is OCD or if this is something related to the pandemic, you would need to see a clinician, and can definitely see someone with no CD. But this is definitely something that can come up with OCD. There are lots of feelings, whether it's because of contamination or because of touching something or because of thoughts or experiences, where we can feel disgust and where we can feel like, despite doing something over and over again, because if y'all haven't figured this out yet, compulsions do not work. They might work at the very beginning, but then over time, things get worse. What tends to happen with OCD is we don't feel satisfied. We don't feel like everything's all better from doing that compulsion. So continuously getting those urges could be a sign of OCD. So glad that you're on here tonight, and would love to have you reach out to a clinician with no CD. Let's see. Love, Lana. It's great to see you too. I know I see you on lots of different streams. So awesome to see you. Okay. My loved one is struggling with this, but says it's spiritual, not common OCD, and believes nobody will understand him or the darkness of what he suffers. He has nightmares and cannot touch most things. I don't know all the details of what you're describing. I think you might have been responding to some of the spiritual aspects that I was talking about. But what I do want to note, just because this piece is coming up, is that I literally hear from folks every single day who feel like they're having spiritual issues or who feel like they're having faith issues, and it's actually OCD. It's important to note that if you're experiencing obsessions around your faith, if you're experiencing moral scrupulosity, if you're experiencing religious scrupulosity, it's not a faith issue. It's not because you're doing something wrong with your faith. It's very much an OCD issue. But OCD can make you question all sorts of aspects of your faith. And again, that's a lot of the work that I do with folks of trying to pick out, okay, what's faith? What's OCD? What does that look like? But important to note, OCD is not a faith issue. It's just the same old OCD latching onto something that's really, really, really important to you. But it can be hard. It can be hard. Again, I hear from folks every day who are navigating that. So if you're trying to parse that out, I promise you are not alone. Okay. Interesting comment. I like that you're clergy. I wish I was religious, but I don't have the gene. I feel like it would help my OCD. You know, OCD really, I mean, it doesn't really have to do with that faith aspect. Yes, I'm clergy and faith is important to me. But I think for a lot of folks with OCD, yeah, faith might be important to them. And then their OCD might latch on to the faith aspect. I think really the key to helping OCD doesn't really have to do with what your background is or what your religion is or what your beliefs are. It has to do with living into and engaging in that treatment, like exposure and response prevention. And I'm happy to answer questions about what exposure and response prevention is if there are folks who don't know what that is, because that's really important evidence-based treatment related to OCD. But I do appreciate the affirmation too. Does anyone know what theme she has? Yeah, so I can answer that. I'm assuming she is me. So since I'm the only one on here tonight. So I've had pretty much every theme that you can possibly imagine throughout my life. Sorry, my hair is like kind of weird. It's backwards on the screen, so I always feel kind of wonky. But everything you can imagine from the time I was about 8 years old. I can remember walking into particular rooms, feeling like I needed to touch things in a particular order to protect loved ones. By the time I was in, third grade or so, I lost my aunt to cancer and I blamed myself. I thought it was my fault somehow that I had done something wrong, that I had done something inappropriate. And that was really my first harm thought. And I started having what my parents at the time called worries. And I was this kid who was really, really nice to everybody, was getting citizenship awards at school, was really high functioning, but was coming home and obsessing, wasn't able to sleep, was calling my parents into my room in the middle of the night saying, what if I harm someone? What if I say something bad? What if I do something bad? My parents didn't understand what I was going through, so they took me to a therapist, and I was doing talk therapy, which is not helpful for OCD. I needed to be doing exposure and response prevention, but I pretended to get better because I didn't want my therapist to think that he was bad at his job. So continue to go through my life, getting sicker and sicker and sicker, jumping from theme to theme. Spent a lot of my teenage years and into college really stuck on kind of this perfectionism aspect, but also stuck on checking. Got to the point eventually in college and in grad school where I really wasn't sleeping because I was up all night checking ovens, stoves, locks, even in seminary, driving back to churches to make sure that I hadn't left the candles on or the doors unlocked, to make sure that I hadn't somehow done something that could create harm. And by the time I got to my first role in ministry as a school chaplain for about 2,700 students in a pretty public role, I completely fell apart with new themes, particularly relating to harm and to false memories, moral scrupulosity, religious scrupulosity. I started to worry that I was a danger to my students. I started to worry that I was going to do something negative in the future, whether that was something physically harmful or saying something bad. I worried that I had already done something and I'd somehow forgotten. Spent pretty much all of my time at night coming home and checking. I would spend 10, 12 hours a day with students, helping them navigate trauma and tragedy and leading in a pretty big role. And then I would come home and try to not call the police on myself for crimes that I hadn't committed that I would see on TV. So I got pretty sick. And yet it was really, for me, eventually hitting rock bottom and believing in many ways everything the OCD was telling me that gave me the courage and the need to get that treatment that saved my life. And I know the treatment that we're here to continue talking about. The same treatment that I think Diane is asking about in this question Is there a way that you can completely get rid of OCD? Diane, that's a really great question. And I think it's a two-part answer. One is OCD is something that I think we have to acknowledge will be with us forever. But I think acknowledging that helps us also to know that it is not something that has to impact our lives forever. I read an article a long time ago that talked about how part of really getting better and reclaiming from your life from OCD is continuing to acknowledge that you have OCD and changing the way that you approach your life. So for me at this point, exposure and response prevention, it doesn't mean that I'm sitting down and physically doing exposures every single day of my life. It means that I try to use every single thing that pops up that makes me nervous as an exposure. And it's not even something that I necessarily do consciously. It's kind of, I mean, sometimes it is. There are some times there are struggles. I'll say over the holidays, like for a lot of people, there were some rough moments. But for the most part, most of life, something will pop up. I'll have 2 seconds where I'll say, oh, I guess I'll have to sit with the uncertainty. And then I completely forget about it and move on. So I'd say that we can acknowledge that OCD might always be a part of our experience, that there isn't a quote unquote cure, and yet it is not by any means something that has to continue to take away life. And part of that is really living into that uncertainty. Two of the advocates that I work with, Ethan Smith and Liz McInvale with the IOCDF, they had a stream a couple weeks ago, and I loved this metaphor that they were giving about always playing whack-a-mole with the OCD throughout ERP, where it was like, oh, there's a new theme, I'm going to whack that one. Oh, there's a new theme, I'm going to whack that one. And I think part of really moving into a life where you're not impacted by OCD is not just accepting the uncertainty around individual fears and saying, oh, I'm going to get rid of that, or I'm going to get rid of that. It's embracing general uncertainty in every aspect of life. It's acknowledging that everybody has to live with uncertainty, but also that you have OCD. So that uncertainty is going to be a little bit more challenging. But if you sit with it, if you're willing to feel that discomfort, even for a few seconds, that once you've made it through treatment, it will disperse and it will get better and it will get easier, knowing that it's not going to be as hard as it is in this moment forever, and that you can live a very full life where there are more good days than bad, even with the OCD. And I would say at this point, even the experiences I've had with OCD, as much as they have sucked in so many different ways, as I know a lot of y'all can relate to, I wouldn't give back any aspect of my life because of where I am today and the advocacy and the work that I get to do. So no, can't get rid of OCD, but you can live this really amazing and meaningful life. Okay. Great question. Okay. Pure OCD. Hi, Katie. What is the best way to trust that pure OCD thoughts about relationship aren't important and should be completely disregarded? So great question. First, just defining some terms. Pure OCD. A lot of times folks talk about this as purely obsessional OCD. Really, there are actually compulsions as a part of this. Those compulsions just aren't necessarily visible. So, the compulsions a lot of times are things that you can't see physically. They're things that are happening in our heads when folks are talking about pure O. And that might be that you're ruminating, that you're checking, that you're going through things over and over again, but in your mind. For me, that's a lot of the things that I've experienced. Here's the thing about the relationship though. Our OCD is a big one, but even in your question, and you might notice this, you're asking for a little bit of reassurance. And I'm not picking on you about that. I do and have done the exact same thing. And my partner, who is sitting downstairs, would probably tell you that I've done a lot of the same thing, even with our OCD. But I don't think you're going to like my answer. There really isn't a way to for me to completely give you reassurance and say, well, it's definitely just OCD. We should completely disregard it. And that might spike your anxiety a little bit. And here's what I'll say. If it spikes your anxiety a little bit for me to say that, that is a really good thing, because that means that you are fighting the OCD. Every time that anxiety spikes, it's a really great opportunity for us to say, you know what, I'm really anxious, but I'm going to sit with that discomfort and I'm going to do something meaningful anyway. And that's what the ERP is about. It's about exposing yourself to the fear. So in that moment, in this moment, it might be me saying, I don't know, could be real, could not be real. And it's about not responding in a way that's compulsive. It's about not responding by giving yourself reassurance. It's by not responding looking for reassurance, looking to your partner for reassurance. It's just disregarding it anyway, even if you're not entirely sure it should be disregarded. OCD will never let us have certainty that it's not important. But here's the little tiny bit of kind of certainty that I'm not certainty, but here's the little tiny little snippet of maybe reassurance that I maybe shouldn't give, but we'll give you. Is that OCD tends to latch onto the things that are the most important and the most significant to us. So if your OCD is latching onto your relationship, just like I was talking about faith earlier, it's probably because your relationship is really important. And if you're even asking the question, is this OCD? You should really choose to treat it as OCD. There have been times when I felt pretty certain that something was OCD, and there have been other times where I really almost didn't think it was, but I had a hunch it might be. And what I would say is if you even are asking the question, even 2%, like, is this OCD? It might be, choose to treat it as OCD. Really, that's a big part of recovery. Choose to treat it as OCD, trusting that if there's something that really needed to be addressed, you would address it without even asking the question. If you're saying, is this OCD? Probably best to treat it as OCD. It probably is. I'm not going to say 100%, but it probably is. And moving forward with that uncertainty and living into that value, into that relationship regardless, is really, really important. So thank you for that awesome question. Okay. I suffer from harm OCD and am in therapy, but I'm always doubting my identity and who I am, and sometimes just feel very lost in life and in myself. How do we stop the self-doubt? Okay, I feel for this one in so many ways because that's something that I navigated for such a long time. Harm OCD for me, both related to future and past. So for me, I was worried, what if I do something horrific in the future? What if I commit a violent crime? But I even went through phases where I was really, really worried. What if I did something bad in the past and I forgot about it? What if I caused harm in the past and forgot about it? Again, to the point, at one point in my life, even as a minister, that I was almost calling the police on myself just to check to make sure I hadn't committed crimes and forgotten. I felt like I had absolutely no idea who I was. I was questioning who I was. I was questioning my identity, questioning if I was a good person, questioning if I was a good chaplain. Sometimes we'll call that imposter syndrome, where we might not even feel like we're the person that we really want to be. And I think there's actually an exposure in this too. And this is really the point that I came to. If you're doubting your identity, if you're questioning who you are, if you're feeling really lost in life, it's not about stopping the self-doubt. It's about letting that doubt be there and moving forward in a way that's meaningful regardless, in a way that's value-driven. You're going to hear me say value-driven a lot, a lot, a lot. That's a part of acceptance and commitment therapy. I'm happy to talk more about that if folks have questions. But it's choosing those things that you feel are important and moving towards them, even if you're questioning. So for me, I was questioning, well, am I a good person? Am I really worthy of being a minister? What does this look like? And at the end of the day, I could say, well, I don't know if I'm a good person, but spending time with my students, teaching my students, that's a value. So regardless of who my OCD is telling me that I am, I'm going to continue to teach my students. I'm going to continue to do that in a meaningful way. And I kept moving towards that, even if I questioned my identity. And eventually, you know what? When the OCD started to simmer down a little bit, that identity came back out. And I really found that it was just the OCD that had been latching on to my identity. It had been making me question my identity. It's never taking away your identity. It's not. It's making you, as you said, doubt your identity, but it's not taking that away. And that's always still present. So even if you're doubting it, don't try to stop the self-doubt. Let it be there, but continue to move forward, even if you're uncomfortable, towards things that are meaningful to you. Okay. I'll try to see if I have some different questions here. Yeah, Jessica, thanks for that. Just wanted to say that when I pray for all of us with OCD. I feel better, not as a compulsion, but I like asking God to give us strength. I love that. That's super, super beautiful. Yeah, I think there's a big distinction between in religious communities, someone saying, if you pray harder, you'll get rid of your OCD, and asking God to give us strength through treatment that's really, really challenging. And I do that all the time as a minister, as a faith leader, as an interfaith chaplain who also works in the OCD world, asking God to give us strength for these really, really, really hard exposures. And I always talk about, and I work with folks from a lot of different faith traditions, so this can apply in different ways. But I always talk about kind of the recovery trinity, that it's possible to have faith in a higher power, whatever that looks like for you, possible to have faith in yourself, and possible to have faith in treatment all at the same time, again, in ways that are meaningful and significant to each of you. So thanks for that, Jessica. Okay. Hannah, great question. My question for today, OCD and mental illness is very draining. How do you regain that lost energy? Working in burnout is common and hard to get out of. Absolutely. I think one of the things with OCD that sometimes folks who aren't in the midst of the struggle don't necessarily realize is that we are fighting a battle in our minds all the time. I tend to be someone who's really high functioning, and that could be for better or for worse, because it actually prevented me from getting treatment for a long time because folks didn't know how much I was struggling. But I would go through a whole day of doing my job, of working with students, of doing whatever it was that I was doing. And it was like I was living two lives. I was living the life where I was in the present with those around me, but I was also living the life in my head where I was literally like fighting this samurai battle with my OCD and against my thoughts. So I have kind of two answers to this question. One is give yourself lots and lots of compassion, acknowledging that lost energy and feeling really, really tired, feeling burnout is not a sign of something that you're doing wrong. It means either one, that you're fighting your OCD, or two, even that you're maybe navigating treatment for the first time and that's really tough. I know for me, going through ERP was really challenging and it made me even more tired, and giving yourself compassion to know that it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong is really important. Two, trust that by moving through treatment, where you learn to sit with the anxiety, to sit with the discomfort, to sit with those feelings, that over time, that energy really, really, really will come back. It will. I didn't believe that it would. I had periods where I felt like I was just completely exhausted. But trusting that treatment, continuing to do the things that are meaningful to you, it really will come back in ways that are powerful. I went from 2 years ago feeling just absolutely awful in treatment and drained to racing right now 50 ultra marathons in 50 states for OCD post-treatment. And very possible for that energy to come back. Doesn't mean that you all have to go out and race 50 ultra marathons, I promise, but it's very possible for it to come back in ways that are meaningful to you, and you will regain that and can trust that process through treatment. Okay. Why should someone with OCD who isn't as far ahead in their ERP work as they'd like to have hope? Okay, got it. So you're not as far along as you would like to be. Where does that hope come from? Yeah, so I think it can look really frustrating sometimes. We see others around us, whether that's in OCD advocacy, on Instagram, on live streams, at conferences, whatever that looks like. And it looks like people are really, really far ahead of maybe where we are with their ERP journey. And I know for me, it was always really frustrating because I felt like I'm doing all the work in ERP and those people look so much better and I'm not feeling any better. And what does that mean? I always felt like I was never going to get there. Like that was never something that was possible for me. And so first for me, it was, I'm not sure if you're doing this, but in my experience, I was comparing myself a lot to where I thought other people were, and kind of stopping that process was really helpful for me, and realizing that a lot of folks, even if they don't look like they're struggling in treatment, it really can be a tough process. And there are a lot of people who navigate that. But here's the other thing. Even if you feel like you're not exactly where you want to be, there is so much hope just based on the fact that you're in treatment. Seriously. And sometimes it's just a matter of hitting certain points in treatment where you take big strides. I know for me, sometimes it felt like I was kind of crawling through sand. And then I would hit a moment where I really had some sort of insight and I would take a jump forward. And then I might get frustrated because I would take a few steps back and then I would take another leap forward. And I think that's what it is. It's always a little bit forward, a little bit back, up, big step forward, a little bit back. And even if you're not as far along as you would like to be, the fact that you are in ERP, the fact that you're working is a reason to have hope. It takes some folks 17 years to get into treatment or to get a diagnosis. And being in a space where you're strong enough to be getting that treatment is amazing and is awesome. And I want you to hear that even if you're not in a place right now where you feel like you have hope, I really believe that even a month from now, 2 months from now, a year from now, you can be in a totally different place. 2 years from now, I would have told you that I would never, ever talk about my OCD and that I thought I was going to be sick forever. And I'm in a place now where I'm enjoying my life more than I ever have and completely open to these conversations. I'm working in OCD work full time now. And you can get there. Also, trust that feeling how we're feeling in the moment isn't always reflective of how we're doing in treatment. Sometimes we feel like we're not doing well in treatment because we're like, we're not feeling better. Why aren't we feeling better? What's wrong? And sometimes we're making a lot of progress and the way that we feel hasn't really caught up yet. So know that the way that you're doing isn't necessarily based on how you're feeling, but on how you're acting. If you're resisting those compulsions, if you're doing those exposures, that's a win. If you're able to get through the day and do less compulsions, ask for reassurance less than you were doing before, that's a really big win. And trust that the way that you feel will catch up after. And that was really, really helpful for me. So I hope that's helpful for you. Okay. Oh, wow. I'm still at very early questions. Okay. I'll try to go faster. Sorry, y'all. These are just really, really great questions. Okay. Any advice for checking? I feel an urge to check on how I'm feeling. And if I feel off, if I do feel off, it usually makes me spiral into the fear of going crazy. Any tips? Yeah. Checking, obviously a big component for OCD. For some people, that's very physical. That can also be mental checking. And for many, that might be looking internally, looking for signs and symptoms that something's wrong. Just like the other things I've been talking about tonight, going back to sitting with that uncertainty, saying maybe, just like in exposure and response prevention, being able to say, you know what, something may be off, but I'm not going to continue to check. It may be, it may not be. I'm not sure, but I'm going to continue to move forward with my life. That fear of going crazy is really, really common. I went through a long period with that, and there are lots of exposures and scripting exercises you can do with your clinician around that. But it all comes back to sitting with the uncertainty, saying maybe, maybe not, who knows? And I'm going to move forward anyway. And I know you can do it. Okay. Let's see. Okay. How do you handle COVID? Yeah, it looks like some other folks are jumping in here in the chat, and I'm so glad. Would love to hear from others in ways that they're navigating. I just want to point out that there are lots of, I think, different ways that COVID's impacted folks with OCD. That might be folks specifically who are navigating some sort of contamination OCD. That could also be scrupulosity, fear of bringing harm to others. There could be some magical thinking. There are lots of different pieces with COVID that can come up. I know for me, the big piece has been around scrupulosity, but it's really tough. And yet, what I always say is I think that folks with OCD, folks who are in treatment, folks who have been doing treatment, that we are even more equipped to handle the uncertainty of COVID. I work with students all the time who are really struggling, rightfully so, with the toll that COVID has taken on the mental health of our society. And one of the things that I think is interesting about folks with OCD is for so many in our society, it's the first time that folks have been asked to live into the uncertainty where we don't know exactly what's going to come next. And I think COVID gives us an opportunity, as much as it's really challenging, to use our exposure skills to move forward still in ways that are value driven for us. Of course, following guidelines and being careful, that's important, but not doing it based on our OCD, moving forward in ways that are meaningful. So please give yourself compassion that we are in the midst of a pandemic, and that's really hard, really challenging, really scary, especially for folks with OCD. But also find comfort in the fact that the treatment that you've been doing, I always feel like folks with OCD are so prepared to mentally handle that uncertainty that we're being asked to face right now. And I know y'all are, regardless of how you're feeling in this moment, doing a great job. Okay. Okay, I'm scrolling down here, seeing if I see any more question marks. Okay, I did I tackled that a little bit, but again, themes I've suffered with gone from anywhere from checking to harm OCD to POCD, religious scrupulosity, moral scrupulosity, false memories, pretty much anything you can possibly imagine. So I'm sure a lot of y'all can relate to that too. Okay. Is it common that people with scrupulosity exaggerate things when they seek reassurance, perhaps adding twists to their questions to be absolutely certain? I can't speak for everybody, but I can say yes for me. I have completely done that. My family actually always talked about, even from the time of being a kid, the way that I exaggerated, and some of that was always around seeking reassurance, adding little twists to be absolutely certain that they totally got it, and even if it was a little bit worse than what I was kind of describing, would it still be okay? Yeah, 10,000%. That can definitely come up. Oh, great question. Okay, so I keep saying ERP. Keep saying exposure and response prevention. How do you do ERP correctly? So again, not a clinician, but from an advocacy perspective, lived experience perspective, exposure and response prevention is really under the umbrella of cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's a particular type of treatment that is the gold standard for OCD, where you're being exposed to those things that you're really afraid of. That's the E part, the exposure, and you're prevented from responding in a way that's compulsive or in a way that's lessening that anxiety. So exposure and response prevention. So the way that you actually do that can look really different depending on what your particular situation is, what your themes are. So when you work with a clinician, they're going to help you do things that expose you to your fears. Now, those could be things that are very physical. That could be actually touching an object. That could be going to a place that's scary. That could be writing something that's scary. That also could be imaginal exposures. That could be imagining a feared event. That could be creating a loop tape to listen to something over and over again. That could be doing something imperfectly. So you're being exposed to that thing that's scary. You're having that anxiety go up, and you're not responding in a way to decrease that anxiety. Over time, it's not about, I think this is a big fallacy. A lot of times with ERP, folks assume like, oh, I'm doing the ERP, so I know that the fear isn't actually something to be afraid of. That's not why we're doing it. We're not trying to get any sort of certainty from the ERP. Really, the whole point is to train your brain to get uncomfortable sitting with that anxiety, sitting with that uncertainty, because OCD is really false alarms that are going off in our brain consistently. Kind of like when, yes. So if you saw a bear outside, obviously you would feel some level of anxiety because your body is protecting you from getting eaten by a bear. Well, with OCD, we're having that same level of anxiety all the time, even when there's not a bear standing directly in front of our face. So the ERP is teaching us that we can sit with that level of anxiety, and eventually the false alarms don't continue to go off in the way that they once did. So exposure, exposing yourself to the fear, response prevention, sitting with that anxiety, sitting with that fear, getting comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. Okay, more questions? Absolutely. Always, 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 always happy to share. Um, oh, okay. This is a great one. Since we're talking about ERP, How to overcome, am I doing ERP right? Or am I anxious enough doing this ERP exercise? Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on this. I struggled with this a lot because perfectionism was always a big component for me. So there was always this question of, oh, am I doing ERP right? Am I doing it right enough? Am I doing it the right amount of time? Am I saying the right things? Am I doing the right things? You can actually start to have OCD around your OCD treatment and making sure that you're doing it right. So overcoming this, it's kind of funny. You kind of have to use some reverse psychology and by using ERP to overcome this idea of doing ERP right. It's sit with the idea that you might not be doing it right. Maybe even mess up an exposure occasionally. Maybe do it for the wrong amount of time. Maybe do it a few more times than you're supposed to. Maybe do it one less time than you're supposed to. You can talk to your therapist about how to maybe do some things that aren't quite right with your exposure, but still be okay moving on from that. Another piece, I hear this a lot, that am I anxious enough doing this ERP exercise? Two components. One, sometimes it's hard for us to really make ourselves anxious when we're not actually in that really anxiety provoking situation. And that can be for a lot of reasons, but one of them is sometimes for those with OCD, it's really hard for us to be present because our brains are a lot of different places with a lot of different obsessions. So sometimes actually doing a mindfulness exercise before starting our exposure exercise can help us to be present and to feel that anxiety a little bit more. The second piece of this is it isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world if you're not feeling quote unquote anxious enough. Sometimes I have trouble getting my anxiety up actually in that moment with that planned exposure. And just by doing it, you're still showing your brain that you're willing to live into that fear that maybe is scaring you at other points during the day. It's also something that may even heighten your anxiety hours after that exposure exercise. And it's giving you another opportunity to sit with that anxiety and to move through with the response prevention, even if it's not right when you're doing that exercise. So I'd say don't get caught up if you're not anxious enough, and just continue to do those things that you're supposed to be doing and trust that process. But when I say supposed to be doing, I don't mean you have to do it 100% right, because we don't have to. So don't get too caught up in doing your exposures right. You can, or I always say ERP. I use ERP as a verb, so I'll say, "Hey, go ERP." I know it's ERP, but you can ERP your ERP. Okay. My girlfriend really wants kids. We're both still really young, not even in our 20s yet, and probably won't think about it till we're 25. But I have HOCD, kid related. And should I even have OCD? Um, so you're thinking kind of harm OCD type stuff. Okay. Yeah. Or any type of OCD that you're really thinking about, whether that's harm OCD or significant other OCD, or sexual orientation OCD, or POCD, any type that you're thinking about, I would say should not ever, ever, ever deter you from doing anything that you value, including if that means having kids. OCD simply latches onto the things that are the most significant to you. And I think that it would be a real shame if you didn't do something that brought you joy, something that was valuable to you, just because your OCD made you feel like you weren't worthy of that, or just because your OCD made you feel like you shouldn't do that. OCD lies, y'all. OCD lies a lot. And yes, we're sitting with the uncertainty in all of these things, but I'm still going to tell you that OCD is probably lying to you, and you completely deserve to do all of the things that bring you joy. My partner, who also has OCD and is an advocate, has said the same thing in the past of, well, should he have kids? And I think he is going to be a fantastic dad someday. And I think it would be a real shame if he let his OCD dictate that, because one, he's taking away the opportunity to have kids from himself, but two, he's taking that opportunity away from children who would have an amazing dad. And Hannah, I think that's the same thing for you. I think that if that's something that you want to do, you would be an amazing, amazing mom, and you should never let your OCD dictate what that looks like for you. Okay. I realize that medication is just a small component in dealing with OCD, but in my case, I'm treatment resistant and no meds help me. Depression, anxiety, OCD, ADHD, panic. Question. Are there, oh no, it cut off your question because my thing doesn't let me see the whole thing. Okay. So, okay. Sorry. Here we go. Are there effective measures other than ERP, DBT, CBT? Um, so that's a really great question. There's actually some other streams that you can take a look at research that's happening right now. There's some really awesome research in the OCD field about treatments, about medications, about all sorts of different things. But here's the other thing that I would say. I'm curious, and this is a question for you. So, and you're welcome to reach out to me after if you have an answer to this. I'm curious if you're currently engaged in ERP, what that looks like for you, and what your clinician thinks about you being treatment resistant. Because while I do acknowledge, yeah, that can very much be a thing, I hear from so many folks that they're treatment resistant, particularly in that area of ERP. I actually thought I was treatment resistant for a really, really long time, not necessarily with the medication component, but with that ERP. And it really was because I was still latching on and kind of undoing some aspects of the ERP unknowingly. Yeah, I was doing the exposures. I thought I was doing response prevention, but I was still very much trying to figure things out and almost undoing it. So it turned out I wasn't really treatment resistant. I was just really still hanging on. So I would be really curious if that's something that you've tackled with a clinician. But you can also check out, let's see, IOCDF recently did some live streams on the future of OCD treatment. So that might be a good place for you to check out some of the other things that are going on too. Okay. What helped you tolerate and or embrace uncertainty? Yeah, this is a really tough one. We all have different things that we're trying to tolerate or embrace uncertainty about. And for me, like for many of you, OCD latched onto everything that was important to me, from my faith to my students to my family to my values. And it always felt completely irresponsible to embrace the uncertainty. I always felt like I was either going to die or I was going to be harmful to someone else. I was going to end up in jail. Like, it was completely life altering stuff for me to embrace that uncertainty. And yet, here's kind of the kicker. There is literally only one thing in my whole life that I'm certain about. And this, I have to give credit to my partner, Ethan Smith, because he actually said this, and it really stuck with me. The only thing that I'm certain about is the fact that if I continue to engage in compulsions, I'll continue to get sicker. Okay. The only thing that I'm certain about is that if I continue to engage in compulsions, if I continue to search for certainty, I'm going to get sicker. I'm not certain about anything else. Okay. But I know that if I keep doing those things, I'm going to give my life up to OCD. I know that trying to find certainty, that trying to get better, that continuing to engage in compulsions hasn't worked. So that only option, if I want to move towards my values, is to try something different, is to tolerate, is to embrace that uncertainty. And it might feel really, really irresponsible, but I'm really certain that if I keep doing those things that I've been doing, I'm going to get sicker. So I have no other choice. I have no other option but to embrace that certainty. Embracing that certainty, tolerating that uncertainty, is the only possible chance you have at moving towards your values, at moving towards those things that are meaningful to you. And in reality, I think that's actually the only responsible thing that you can do. If you know that not embracing the uncertainty, you're going to keep going down that rabbit hole of OCD, the only possible thing for you to do moving forward is to tolerate that uncertainty, is to say, bring it on, anxiety, because I am going to get better. I'm going to live this value-driven life, and I'm going to do the things in this life that I was created to do. And it feels really hard. It sounds simple when you say it. It feels so tough, but it is so, so, so worth it to keep coming back to that idea that, again, the only thing certain is that if you continue to do what you're doing, you're going to get sicker. Do something different. Give yourself a shot at that beautiful life. Um, okay. I'm gonna try to I know I just have 10 minutes left, so I'm trying to see if there's anything here we didn't tackle. Um, okay, what's happening when I have urges with harm OCD? I get really scared when that happens. Yeah, so we hear about urges all the time with different types of OCD that could be related to harm of others or even harm of self. And there's also with POCD. I mean, people talk about groinals. I mean, all sorts of things that we feel or urges that folks might have. So I wouldn't say that these are actually urges. They might feel like urges, but sometimes when we're really, really hyper focused on something, it feels like that's something that we really want to do because we're trying so hard to make sure that we don't do it. So for instance, if someone's driving down the road and they're thinking, I hope I don't run my car off the road. I hope I don't run my car off the road. Your muscles might respond actually by kind of jerking a little bit. And you might say, oh my gosh, I'm trying to run my car off the road. What in the world am I doing? It doesn't necessarily mean you have the urge to run your car off the road. You might feel like you have that urge, but it's because you're so tuned in and you're so hypersensitive to that thing you're thinking of and that you're thinking of trying to not get it to happen. So the same thing comes up with harm, right? So if you're consistently thinking, I hope I don't do that bad thing. I hope I don't do that bad thing. Oh, please don't do that bad thing. Oh, am I going to do that bad thing? You might feel like you want to do it. You might feel like your body's trying to do it when it's just you so hyper focused on that. I used to get into that mode even with words. I would be afraid that I was going to say something derogatory and somebody would walk by and I would think, don't say that thing, don't say that thing. And then I'd feel like, do I want to say that thing? It's just you're hyper focused on it, but it's still really tough. You have to sit with that uncertainty, move towards your values. Um, okay, how do you deal with imposter syndrome with OCD? Yeah, great question. I know I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Imposter syndrome is when you feel like you actually aren't the person that you really are, or the person that you really want to be, the person that people think you are. A lot of times, well, this really can come up in any field, but I would say therapists navigate this a lot, especially therapists with OCD, but even ones without OCD who might feel like, oh, my clients think that I have it all together, and if they only knew. I feel like this all the time as a minister, particularly when I was really struggling, but even now, where folks look to me in maybe a particular way or think that I have it all together. Oh, every time in my chaplain role that somebody says that so there used to be somebody used to always say, oh, we're going to go to Katie because she is like the moral compass of the school. And I would be like, oh, if only they knew all these intrusive thoughts I have, all this stuff. And I think everybody feels like that, whether or not they have OCD. But for those of us with OCD, I know y'all are going to get sick of me saying sit with the uncertainty, exposure, and response prevention and live into your values. But coming back to that, that really, really is a big aspect of it. So for me, it's saying, you know what? I may or may not be those things that everybody thinks that I am, but I'm still going to keep moving forward in a way that's meaningful to me. Everybody might think I'm a nice chaplain. Ugh, I don't know. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not, but it's still really meaningful to me that I do all these things with my students today. So I'm going to do it anyway. And over time, you stop asking yourself the question of if you're an imposter and you just live your life as that person that you truly, truly, truly are. Thank you. I have some thank yous here. Thank y'all too for being here. Oh, yes, please share more about ACT. Yeah, so ACT is acceptance and commitment therapy. There are a lot of clinicians that use that in conjunction with ERP, and there's some kind of values-based components of ERP as well. So there's all sorts of ties that I won't get into, but the whole premise of ACT is that you are letting those emotions be there, that you're letting your thoughts be there, and that you're moving towards things that are value driven anyway. So you're not trying to get rid of your emotions. You're not trying to get rid of your intrusive thoughts. You're not trying to get rid of any experience, but you're saying, that thing over there is the thing that I want to do. I'm going to let all of this stuff be there. I'm going to let it be there like passengers on the bus. I'm a school bus driver and I have all these intrusive thoughts screaming in the back. I'm going to let them be there. I'm not going to tell them to be quiet, and I'm going to keep moving towards my destination. And over time, the screaming intrusive thoughts in the back of the bus start to become a little bit less loud just by nature of you not pushing them away, and you continue to move towards something that's significant and that's important to you. So that's a really, really basic aspect of ACT. But if you work with your clinician on ACT, and I know I do a lot of spiritual ACT work with folks too, and ACT is, I'm having so much fun. My faith and mental health integrative doctorate that I'm working on right now is all based in ACT. So it's been really cool to kind of connect spirituality and ACT and OCD and all sorts of things. But ACT really changed my life. Of course, exposure and response prevention was huge. But the ACT piece was kind of a flip for me, where I realized that I really could sit with all of that anxiety, that I could sit with those intrusive thoughts and still move forward in a way that was meaningful and value-driven to me. So with a clinician, you might even do a values card sort where you think about what are things that are important to me. And that doesn't mean goals. That doesn't mean things you can necessarily accomplish, but it's things that are significant that you can continue to move towards. That might be faith. That might be compassion. That may be time with family. Things that you can move towards that you can let everything else be there. And there's some awesome books out there, especially by Steve Hayes. There's great stuff out there on ACT. And great ACT for OCD books. Oh, all the things. Okay, sorry. I know we have like 4 minutes. Is being exposed as effective as doing exposure? So I'm thinking by this that you mean if something like happens to you that you get triggered as opposed to intentionally doing that exposure. Yeah, anything that comes up where you are triggered in any way, shape, or form, whether it's because you experience something that's contaminated, maybe by mistake, or because you're doing actually an exposure exercise, sitting with that anxiety, moving forward in a value-driven way without the response is going to be the way to go. Okay, I'm trying to see, we have like 2 more minutes here, so I'm trying to see if there's any different questions that we haven't tackled. Oh my goodness, y'all still have so many good questions here. Okay, I'm going to go over a couple minutes. I'm going to do 3 more here. Okay. What are your thoughts on the analogy of the OCD monster? I've heard different points of view, some saying OCD is something we fight, others saying that it's not a separate entity from us to fight. Yeah, I have lots of I have lots of mixed thoughts about this. I actually love the analogy. I just think it's kind of how we approach it. I especially love Sean Shinnick, Draw Your Monster is awesome, where you can kind of separate that OCD component from yourself. But I still think what you're saying, it's not about us necessarily fighting it, because I think sometimes when we try to push it away, right, it comes back stronger. And going back to the ACT intrusive thoughts on the school bus analogy I was just saying. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that quote unquote OCD monster, whatever you want to call it, sometimes some people call it their annoying friend. Sometimes I don't even like to think of it as a huge, scary monster. Sometimes I like to think of it as this kind of annoying little thing that tags along that tries to help me, but in really ineffective ways. But I think we can think of it as this monster, as this thing that's separate from ourselves, without saying, oh, we're going to push it away, we're going to fight it. Instead, we can say that there is this OCD monster that's separate from us, that we're willing to bring along for the ride, that we're stronger than it, and that we're going to let it hang out because we're not afraid of it. So for me, it's both and. I think it's definitely great to be able to separate ourselves from that, but maybe not so much fighting it, but allowing it to be there and not being afraid of it. Okay. Oh, y'all are having such great conversations in the chat. Okay, I'm picking 2 more questions here. 2 more questions here. Okay, I'll be really quick on this one because I know I just said 2 more questions. How did you overcome POCD? Again, I know y'all are going to get sick of these answers, but exposure and response prevention, just like everything else, particularly for me around this theme, it was scripting. It was coming up with scary scripts with my clinician, was sitting with that uncertainty, no matter how bad and awful that made me feel, and continuing to move forward in a way that was value driven, despite what my OCD was saying. Exposure and response prevention all day long. Okay, let's see. Let's do one more here. Um, oh, y'all are just having such great conversations. Okay, good last question. Okay, thank y'all for sticking with me. How do we reconcile that OCD is a symptom of a very anxious brain and some of the value-driven things wanted may exacerbate levels of anxiety and distress long term? Great question. So a couple answers to this. One, sometimes there's this kind of weird loop here, right? That OCD latches onto things that are value driven for us. And those things as a result might give us anxiety, but we want to move towards them because they are values. And you're kind of like, oh, well, how do I navigate this? I think it's changing the way that we think about anxiety and distress. Anxiety and distress aren't inherently bad things. It's the way that we look at that anxiety. It's the way that we look at that distress. We are perfectly capable of handling anxiety and distress while giving ourselves compassion, as long as we're doing something that's meaningful to us. So, for example, with parenthood, a lot of times, yeah, parenthood can be really stressful. And that can even be exacerbated by OCD, because someone who is a parent might really care about their children. They might navigate POCD, they might navigate harm OCD. And it might make it confusing because your OCD is latching onto your values, but ACT is telling you to move towards your values. All of the above. You can continue to do those things that bring you anxiety, as long as those are the things that are really, really important to you. So go ahead, be an awesome parent. Move, sit with that anxiety, move towards those things that are significant to you. It's about changing our relationship with the anxiety, not getting rid of the anxiety. And by changing our relationship with it, over time it will decrease. You're not going to have that same level of anxiety for forever. Great questions. I know there were a couple more on here that I didn't get to, but I tried to tackle as many as possible. I know we're a couple minutes over here. But thank you all so much for being on here tonight. If you want to reach out to me, if there's something I didn't get to, or if you think of something after, if you have other questions, you can, probably the easiest way is to find me on Instagram. So you have my handle right here, RevK Runs Beyond OCD. You can also head over to my website at revkatieodunne.com, and check out all things faith and mental health integrative services, as well as 50 ultras in 50 states for OCD. And really always happy to connect and answer questions. But just want to close by saying thank you all for being here tonight. And for those of you who will watch later on, you are all advocating just by being here, by asking questions, by being in the chat. And I want you to hear from me that I remember sitting and asking questions on forums really similar to this just 2 years ago, and thinking, I will never be where that person is, or I will never get better, or mine's different. And I want you to hear, yours isn't different. You are created to be just an awesome, amazing person, and you deserve to get better. And the world deserves you to get better. The world deserves your awesome, amazing uniqueness. So be willing to live with that uncertainty, because that's really the only responsible thing to do, right? To sit with that uncertainty, to continue to move towards your values, to get better. And as hard as it feels in this moment, I know that you can do it. So thanks y'all so much, and have a good night. Happy New Year.